Throughout the history of recorded music, there have been so many iconic instruments used on some iconic songs. But there's one instrument that you've probably heard many more times than you actually realize, and that's because it's a very easy instrument to miss. And that's an instrument known as a bass six. This is a variation of a 6-string bass, but it's actually a little more closely related to the electric guitar. And in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the history of this instrument, showing you 5 iconic riffs that were played on that instrument, and showing you this very affordable modern alternative from the guys at Gear4Music. This is the G4M 638 Baritone. So the instrument that we know today as the Bass 6 was actually designed and released by Fender in 1961. But Fender did not actually conceptualize this idea of a 6-string bass that lives in a kind of more guitar-based format. That idea actually goes back to 1956 when Dan Electro created the first 6-string bass. Now the Bass 6 was just Fender's updated follow-up to that idea, and the original Bass 6s were actually based very closely on the Fender Jaguar. It had 3 single coil pickups, and it actually had a tremolo system, which is quite unusual for a bass. Now what differentiates a Bass 6 from a bass guitar is the fact that a bass guitar is 4 strings and it's tuned E, A, D, G. And then typically when we go into extended range on bass, we'll go to a low B, maybe a high C, but a Bass 6 is actually tuned E to E. So even though this is tuned E to E, just like an electric guitar would be in standard tuning, we're actually down a full octave, so we're actually in the bass frequency world. But this, although it is technically a bass, can still be played and visualized like a guitar. So this is actually great for guitar players who are making that transition into bass, or for people who are just looking to add an additional lower octave or some extra thickening to existing guitar lines. The Bass 6 has been used on some iconic tracks and iconic albums over the years by some fantastic players. And like I said, even though this is an instrument you've probably heard hundreds of times, because it lives in that bass frequency, you probably don't realize that you've actually heard a Bass 6 rather than a bass guitar. And that's what makes it very interesting. I'm going to be showing you 5 of those iconic riffs very shortly in this video. Before I do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about this instrument. This is the Gear4Music G4M 638 Baritone. I want to say a big thank you to my friends over at Gear4Music for sponsoring the video and hooking me up with the G4M 638 Baritone. There are some links down below in the description if you want to find out more about this instrument. Please go and check those out. Now, the word baritone is actually slightly deceptive in this instance because a baritone is typically tuned B to B. It's a 5th below E. Now, this is tuned E to E, so it's actually a full octave down. So we would actually consider this to be, in this instance with this tuning, a Bass 6 or a bass instrument rather than a baritone instrument. But what you could do is you could actually put some different strings on this, tune it B to B, and then it would function as a baritone. But in the way that it comes from the retailer, it would technically be considered more of a bass instrument. So the first thing to mention about the G4M 638 is the price that this sits in. Now, even though Fender still produced the Bass 6, and you can still find it in and out of the catalog over the years, much like the Squier variation as well, and you can always pick these up on the resale market, the prices can be a little on the higher side. And as a guitar player, if you're looking to experiment with this kind of sound or this kind of instrument, you might not want to outlay a lot of money on that, on the off chance that you might not like it. The G4M 638 is a bit of a no-brainer to buy because it actually retails at £199 in the UK, which, to be honest, for the way this plays out of the box and the way it sounds and the functionality it gives you, is a fantastic price. But also, it allows you to enter that Bass 6 world without a huge financial outlay. So spec-wise, we've got this gloss white finish over an alder body. There's enough weight to this to let you know that you're playing a bass instrument without it being as heavy as a regular bass. Then we've got a pair of humbuckers here. They're just Gear4Music's own humbuckers. But what's interesting about that is humbuckers, or guitar humbuckers, on a bass instrument give you a very different sound. So bass pickups will really unlock that low subbiness that a bass has. Having guitar humbuckers will actually cut some of that low end out, give you a bit more mid-range focus, a bit more of that kind of mid-range punch, and a lot more brightness. So if you're looking for a bass instrument that kind of cuts through the mix a bit, or to add another texture to a recording, this is a great choice for that, because those pickups will give you a very different sound. And we've got a single volume, single tone, and a 3-way pickup switch that works as you'd expect with a bridge, both, and neck pickup. We've got a Tune-o-matic style bridge and a string through body, as you can see there, and it's a bolt-on neck. The neck is maple, and as I mentioned earlier, it is 30 inches in scale. On top of that, we've got a maple fretboard with black binding and black block inlays. The frets are extra jumbo frets, and they are nickel silver, and this has a 16-inch radius. Graphtec nut, reverse headstock, which I think looks great on an offset guitar, and unbranded tuners, which to be honest feel pretty solid. I've not gigged this or used it in a heavy capacity, but the tuners feel like they're holding the tune pretty well. And actually the fretwork on this is, dare I say, probably the best I've ever seen on a 200-pound guitar, or a sub 200-pound guitar, I should say. You actually can't feel the fret ends. They're nicely rounded off. The frets are smooth. It's very easy on the hand, and I can't actually feel anything about this that I dislike, which is quite interesting, because usually at this price point there's always a couple of things that you probably want to change maybe. All right, so let's talk about some iconic riffs that were played on a Bass 6 style instrument. The first one I'm going to show you is from The Cure, and it's a track called Pictures of You. Were one of the bands who really helped revitalize and repopularize the Bass 6 in the 1980s, and Pictures of You is a great example of that. There's a bunch of live footage of Robert Smith playing this part live on a Bass 6. And like I said earlier, it just adds different texture to a bass style instrument. It cuts through the mix nice, you get that additional twang, and if you follow suit and layer it up with loads of choruses and reverbs and delays like The Cure do, you get some really, really cool tones. Next up, we've got a bit of reggae fun with 10cc. A Bass 6 was used for all the bass parts on the track Dreadlock Holiday. This is the bass line from the chorus of the song. So even though this song references Jamaica quite a lot, it's actually not about Jamaica at all. It's actually about Barbados. And it's actually about some things that happened to Justin Hayward of the Moody Blues while he was on holiday in Barbados. During the recording of Dreadlock Holiday, 10cc bassist Graham Goulding famously played a Bass 6 on the recording. But there's also a bunch of live footage of him out there playing a Bass 6, performing this track live as well. Next up, we're going country with the Glenn Campbell classic Wichita Lineman. So Wichita Lineman was a pretty big hit for Glenn Campbell in the country world, and the Bass 6 intro line is a very prominent part of the song. Glenn recorded this himself, but technically he didn't play it on a Bass 6, he actually played it on a Dan Electro 6-string that he borrowed from session musician Carol Kay. However, when it came to performing the track live, there's plenty of footage out there of Glenn playing a Fender Bass 6 on stage to perform this track. The next riff I want to show you is a great example of when a Bass 6 is hidden on a record and you probably didn't even know it was there. This is Helter Skelter by the Beatles. So the Beatles being on this list is a very interesting one because there are Bass 6 instances all over the Beatles catalogue. And there are two main things that would typically happen. If it was a song they were recording in the studio where Paul McCartney would play piano instead of bass, John Lennon would typically play the bass on a bass 6. But what would also happen is sometimes, and this is true in the instance of Helter Skelter, they would just double Paul's bass line with a bass 6. So on the record, you've got Paul playing the bass line, but then you've also got John Lennon doubling it with the bass line on a bass 6. This just gives the bass more attack, more kind of grunt and aggression, and gives you that fat rock sound that the Beatles helped to pioneer. And the final one I want to show you is the Aerosmith riff for the song Back in the Saddle. This is my favorite bass 6 riff of all time. So this one was actually the very first instance where I ever heard a bass 6 in a recorded situation. The studio version was actually tuned a semitone lower. I'm in standard tuning. The studio version was recorded in E flat. Joe Perry still plays a 6-string bass variation live to this day. The last time I personally saw Aerosmith live, he was playing an Ernie Ball Music Man 6-string bass, but he recorded the original on a bass 6. Now on the record, you can hear that it's there, but again, it's not super obvious because there's also a guitar part that kind of counters it. So on paper, it just sounds like guitar and bass playing off against each other. But again, it's actually a bass 6 doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the mix. So I've shown you 5 of my favorite bass 6 riffs, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a ton of them out there. There's some iconic players playing this instrument on some iconic tracks. You'll also find the bass 6 in the hands of players like Jet Harris from The Shadows, Dwayne Eddy, Brian Molko from Placebo, and even Jack Bruce from Cream played a bass 6 at some point in his career. It's an iconic instrument with a lot of cool things to offer, and I think as a guitar player, this is a really cool way to get into some bass-like textures without buying a bass. And also, if you are a guitar player, the fact that you can do things like play power chords on this is really cool, and on a clean tone, you can actually play some chords. There can be some issues with intervals when you get quite low, and some intervals won't work as well as others, especially major thirds. If you're playing major thirds down low, they're gonna sound a little bit dissonant, but things like bar chords can also work great. Or you could crank the gain and play some guitar solo. Well, okay, maybe guitar solos are a little tricky on this thing because of the huge strings, but you can do it if you want to. But there we go. There is the G4M 638 Baritone. Once again, big thank you to my friends over at Gear4Music for sponsoring the video and sending this really cool thing for me to check out. If you've enjoyed this, or you've hated it, or whatever, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the bass 6 as an instrument. And if you are into bass 6, I'd love to hear what your favorite bass 6 riffs are as well. I've mentioned a bunch in this video, but I'm sure there's a ton that I don't know about that I would also like to hear. So let me know what bass 6 riffs you enjoy as well. Thank you all so much for watching as always. If you've enjoyed this video, as always, please hit the like button. Please consider subscribing if you're new to the channel as well. I'll see you guys very soon. Thank you so much for watching.